It had been a long day, it had been a stressful day, and I was driving home from work, and all I could think of, if there was a cliff, I'd have driven straight off it. Thankfully, I was living in a place called Dubbo in Australia, which is about as uncliffy as they come. The whole place is like a billiard table. I think there's one hill in the entire town. But it really hit me that this was not my right frame of mind, and I needed to do something about it. I ended up getting therapy, and I was put on some medications to help overcome what was a severe depression that I'd entered into. Why had I reached that? I don't have a depressive personality. I'm not someone who has those issues generally in life. But I'd hit rock bottom, and my head was a mess. It was in a very, very dark place, and I didn't know what the future held. The reality is I was burnt out, mentally, physically, but mainly mentally, emotionally. I had a lot of residual stuff from my childhood that was carrying on with me, and I couldn't get over it, and it was surfacing. I'd spent so long pushing it down and not dealing with it that my brain was just not able to cope with that constant suppressing of my emotions, of my needs, of my wounds, my traumas from my childhood. That was my experience, as close as I can come to understanding what burnout is like. It's one of those things that for autistic people, for neurodivergent people, can really, really hit. And it all ties up, generally speaking, with masking. Now, I've spoken about masking on this channel many a time. It's one of my main thrusts of really wanting to get the information about masking out there. It's one of the single biggest barriers to diagnosis and to support for especially our kids when it comes to school and stuff like that. Autistic burnout is something that's become a bit of a keyword at the moment, a catchphrase that's sort of making the rounds, but I don't think it's really understood or why it even occurs. So I wanted to tackle that in this video and look at why autistic people, neurodivergent people can suffer burnout in such a strong way, and why it's different from what we experience as burnout in our everyday lives as neurotypical people. So what is autistic burnout? What is neurodivergent burnout? It seems to occur as a result of exactly what I was experiencing when I went through that period in my life. I'd been repressing a lot of trauma and childhood issues and hadn't dealt with them until that point in my life, and I needed to do something about it. We, as a neurotypical world, really sadly force neurodivergent people to mask. Masking is one of the biggest barriers to diagnosis and to support for especially our kids, but in general for any neurodivergent people. It's one of the things that stops diagnosis and inhibits support that is so important for neurodivergent people. I've said many a time we need to shape a neurotypical world to start allowing for neurodivergence. The problem is that we don't do that. We live in a very neurotypical world, and we seem to force neurodivergent people to comply with our rules, our constructs, our way of life, because neurotypical people are the majority. But that's not fair, and it's not right, and it's not needed. What happens when we force people to mask is that they are repressing their authentic selves. We've all experienced this, I think, in one way or another. We have beliefs that we may be scared to share because we're worried about what shame it might bring upon us, or what people might think of us. We might have things that we've done in our past, mistakes we've made, we don't want people to find out about because they'll judge us now on it. We see it all the time with things like Twitter now, don't we? Things that people posted 20 years ago when they were completely different people, and it resurfaces, and they're having to apologise for their thoughts and the way they were 20 years ago, when in fact they've changed those things. I could be guilty of that. Thankfully I didn't have Twitter around at that point, but I certainly had preconceived ideas of what people should and shouldn't be like, and what was right and what was wrong. And I've come to reevaluate a lot of those things. The problem is when an autistic person or a neurodivergent person masks, they're repressing their true authentic selves. It's going to seem like an odd example, but a really good one, I think, is music for me. I used to be the world's worst music snob. I still probably am, deep down. Most people probably wouldn't like my music, but I used to be very, very, oh, that's not real music, this is crap, that's crap, I don't like dance, I don't like keyboards, rah, 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 rah. I used to go on and on and on and on. One of the beautiful things about having kids, my kids have different tastes to me. Some music we cross over with. My daughter's become a big fan of Blink-182, and I couldn't be prouder. It's just a fantastic parenting win for me. My son's the same. He loves them, and he loves a lot of their music, but they've both got their own individual tastes as well. Even at 8 and 13, they're really developing their own musical tastes, and it's not music that I particularly like. My son listens to a lot of hip-hop based stuff, and I'm not into that at all. But I've come to appreciate that's the music that speaks to him. But the reality is, my prejudice about music could very easily force them into, well, we're not playing that, we're not having that music. No, I don't like that, so we're not playing it. This is how music works in our house. And that's what we do to neurodivergent people when we're forcing them into this world of having to be a certain way. And when you're repressing something for that long, when you're repressing your true self for that long, it builds up and up and up, and it leads to greater problems down the track. We've already discussed many times it can lead to forms of PTSD, bipolar disorder, many other serious mental health conditions that can follow simply because we're forcing people into a state of masking. Moreover, it leads to this autistic neurodivergent burnout, because we simply can't keep things contained for that long. Our true selves has to come out at some point. Those things that we're repressing need to come out at some way, and it comes out in a far more destructive way, like burnout, when we constantly force masking. There are so many signs of autistic burnout, so I'm going to list a few off. Executive dysfunction. Now, this is the kind of thing that happens. Basically, there's an impairment on an individual's ability to perform everyday tasks, the more complex things. So it can include planning and organisation. It can include decision making, impulse control as well. Suddenly getting a lot more irritable, agitated, flying off the handle, having meltdowns for what seemed like no reason. We talked many times about that internal glass of emotion, and once it's full, it all spills out. If we're containing that, if that's been pushed down all those years and it's starting to bubble over, it's going to mean we're more susceptible to meltdowns, to that loss of control, that loss of logic that leads to actions that we may regret. This can affect neurotypical people or neurodivergent people alike. It doesn't matter. This is what happens when we reach that point. I'm sure there are points in time you can look back on in your life where you've just not felt like doing anything. Your heart's just not in it. It's almost a reflection of that. But for, I guess, the neurodivergent side of things, it can actually have a physical manifestation. When your mind is that clouded, when your mind is that full of stuff, if you can imagine for yourself, you're in a room, you're trying to focus on something, you're trying to get something done, but there's just this noise. Somebody next door is playing loud music, you've got a rock band practicing their new set next door to you. On the other side, they're having a party. There's lots of loud music coming from there as well, cheers and screams and whatever else. You've got the kids outside watching television. It's just clack, 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 and there's just noise everywhere. It's impossible to focus, and it's impossible to get the things done that you need to get done in that moment. That's kind of what it's like inside the head of somebody who's dealing with this burnout. It's just exploding with information. Basically, your own abilities are drowned out by all of the other things that are going on inside the head. And once you're in that situation, it's impossible to deal with anything. And so you fall into the area where you're unable to do the things that you need to do. That executive function is affected. Now, executive function can often be affected for neurodivergent people anyway on a more long-term basis. It can be a lifelong thing that they have to deal with because that noise is always in the head. What's happening now is that that's amplified. So you get this burnout. So that leads on to difficulty in trying to start things or make decisions. If you've got something you need to do, procrastinating. It's almost like you sort of become that couch potato. You know, that inability to move. You feel like you're a deer stuck in the headlights. That's really what can happen. Difficulty with self-regulation, your emotional regulation, that kind of stuff, any kind of short-temperedness, or just the fact, maybe you just burst into tears randomly. When I experienced what I experienced with burnout, I was very emotional. I would cry for nothing, and I'm not a crier. I'm not somebody who bursts into tears readily or anything like that, but it really affected me, that inability to control just where I was at, and I got so self-focused, I couldn't see beyond my own realm, if you like. I became incredibly selfish, and I look back and I'm so ashamed, but it was just the way my brain was coping with the situation I was in. So that often happens. It's so focused in on yourself, you just can't look out to anything else. This, of course, leads on some difficulties in just doing everyday things, cooking, cleaning, getting out, having some fresh air, doing anything that's healthy for yourself. It can become such a challenge. Makes social interactions so much harder. So, seeing people, when I was in that state, I'm a very social person. I need my friends. I need good groups of people around me. I'm just that kind of person. I'm very gregarious and I'm very outgoing. And I love people. I just love that interaction, that social interaction. When I was in this place, I just wanted to sit at home and hide away. I was ashamed to be seen. And that can be a really good indicator. If you know somebody who's retreating into that state, it might be a sign they need some support and some help. For a lot of neurodivergent people, it may lead to increased sensory insensitivities. So for my daughter, when she's edging up to that state of, coming toward a meltdown, when her emotional cup is just that full, it's going to overflow. Anything on the proprioceptive side of things, the outer things, noise, lights, too many people, too much going on, it's too much. She needs to retreat into a quiet space and kind of gather herself again in order to avoid moving into that meltdown. That becomes even less bearable when you're in that state of burnout. You're not in a position where you're really in that ability to control it. So all those things become real agitators for the situation. They become catalysts that add to their already very full emotional cup. And that's why you often see, that whole thing, people sitting in darkness or with low lights and stuff like that. Maybe let's put some candles on. Anything that's relaxing, they'll sit in calm places. It's just a way of self-regulating, because that's where you're at in your head. You can't cope with that extra sensory input. You'll often see with neurodivergent people, and especially autistic people, is an increase in stimming. We've discussed stimming on this channel before. It's an important thing. Stimming is a really healthy thing for autistic people. It's this way of self-regulating. So naturally that comes out. If you're in a burnout state, if you're in a state where your brain is just no longer able to cope, you're going to start stimming. You're going to do those things that are self-regulatory. For my daughter, it's curling her hair. She will shake. I jiggle my legs all the time. For my son, his stimming is actually gaming. You'll see him get more and more into a game because he just needs to sort of shut that stuff out. And everybody stims, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. It's just that neurotypical people tend to stim in ways that are more socially acceptable, inverted commas, than neurodivergent people. If you're going shopping, bit of retail therapy, believe it or not, that's a form of stimming. You are regulating yourself by something that's needed. If you go to the gym, you're letting out all that pent-up energy. It's a form of stimming. For me, music, I'll sit there and just get lost in music. It's a form of stimming for me because it regulates my emotions. It regulates my mind. It takes me to a place that I can't get without music, and it helps me to calm. The irony is I listen to quite heavy music, but it's just that place that calms me. I find it very soothing. Playing the guitar is a form of stimming. I vape. It's a form of stimming. It's something to do with my hands. There's so many things that we do every day that are forms of stimming. When we look at it with autistic people, with neurodivergent people, stimming can often be a lot more confronting, I suppose. Not that it should be, but it's just the way we perceive it. Someone shaking or nodding their head or doing something that just seems out of place. We have a tendency to think, well, that's a bit odd, isn't it? And we shouldn't. We should just be, well, that's their way of self-regulating. Giddy up, go for it. As long as they're not harming themselves, as long as it's not harming anybody else, great, go for it. That's exactly what should be the case. When you see that increasing, it's often a sign someone's heading towards that burnout. And over a period of time, it's not just, well, they're stimming a lot today, aren't they? Really looking at it over, I've noticed that they're stimming more regularly over a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a period of time. It's a good way of assessing, okay, there may be something going on here and we need to add more support. A typical one for many autistic people is difficulty in making eye contact. For a lot of neurodivergent people, eye contact isn't something that's very comfortable, especially those with sensory processing disorder. I've spoken to many people who have come up with ways around this. Some people will look at that part of the head rather than looking in the eyes. Eye contact can be physically painful for people with sensory processing disorder. It's certainly very uncomfortable for many people. My daughter likes it when I'm talking to her in the car because I don't have to look at her. I'm focused on the road. She doesn't have to look at me. And we can have a conversation where eye contact isn't required, and it's much easier for her to cope with it in that situation. There's a difficulty making eye contact. So if you're noticing that somebody's making eye contact and it's uncomfortable, it could be that they're really dealing with that as an issue. Eye contact in itself, if we're forcing that on people, we're forcing them to mask. So we're actually exacerbating the issue and leading more likely into burnout. So being able to pull that back, calm it down, don't worry about eye contact. If they're talking to you, they're engaged. Don't worry so much about whether they're looking you in the eye. It's one of those things that neurotypicals, we often see the world as, well, you make eye contact, it's a sign of politeness, it shows you're paying attention. It can be doing the complete opposite for a neurodivergent person. Obviously, you get more frequent meltdowns and shutdowns. This is something that, like I've said already about the internal cup of emotion, when it's nearly full, there are going to be more occasions where it overflows. You're going to get more meltdowns or shutdowns. Shutdown, we talked about it, it's like almost like an internal meltdown. So rather than it being an outward expression of anger and frustration and panic, it's an internal version of that, and it is literally like you just shut down, almost comatose for some people. It just becomes something the whole world shuts down around them. It's a way of coping. When you're at that point where your emotions are just that full, that's where you're going to go. Obviously that goes on to an increased emotional state. Already really talked about that, but that being more sensitive to our emotions and more susceptible to them certainly becomes something that I experienced during that period of my life. That would lead to there was just more time needed to rest and recharge, having the need to just be alone, withdraw. Like I said, for me, I didn't want to see people. It wasn't a healthy thing, but there was a healthy side to it, which was just that I needed to recharge. I needed to get myself back in that healthy headspace. Big one, and I noticed this when I went through my burnout, so to speak, is my memory was shot. When your head's that full of stuff, it's just more information. It doesn't process in the right way. So I'd forget things. I became very forgetful. That cognition really was impaired, and that's something that certainly could present itself. Something that comes along with the needing more rest is often the inability to sleep. So you get like an insomniac style of thing. You're exhausted, you need rest, you're relaxing all the time, but your brain just won't shut off and allow you to sleep. ADHDers deal with this a lot. Basically, the brain is just going off, chattering away in the background, and it just doesn't allow you to get to sleep or to relax or to rest. So it becomes a really important facet in trying to manage that. And that's where support and help becomes so important. And of course, all this is going to lead to a mental exhaustion. That's where I was at. My brain was just exhausted. I was in a real low point and I had to start dealing with stuff, but my brain just wasn't fit to do so. Burnout basically occurs because we're beyond our capacity to any longer deal with a certain situation. When we're overwhelmed, we're overloaded, we're operating beyond our actual capacities. We reach burnout in many different ways. You know, I think for often myself, you're burnt out in one little area or something like that, and it's easier to deal with. When you're dealing with this kind of burnout, it's a complete, soul, mind, and body burnout. Your whole being is affected one way or another. It can often occur during stressful transitions. House moving is a really good example. They reckon it's one of the top 4 most stressful things you can do in your life is move house. Moving schools for kids, it's going to be a huge thing. It's why we see so many problems, I think, occur between the shift from primary school into secondary school. When you reach secondary school, everything's different. It is a culture shock. I remember coming from Australia to live in the UK, and I was surprised at how different it was. You wouldn't think the two countries were that different. We're English-speaking nation. We share the same monarchy. We share the same rules and regulations in so many ways. The laws are almost, identical in almost every way. We have a lot of the same, belief structures and all that kind of stuff that goes along with it. But it was just the subtle little differences. And I wasn't prepared for it. I was really surprised at how it affected me, at how different the UK was to living in Australia. Just in that cultural side of things, and just in the difference in history, just in the difference between a roundabout. The roundabouts in England are very different from roundabouts in Australia. In Australia, there's a very set rule about what side of the road you're on if you've got a 2-lane roundabout. Here, you've got traffic lights on roundabouts. What the hell's with that? Like those little things that you have to adapt to. It can be a massive shift, and those life-changing things can really bring on that burnout. And of course, as I've said, masking. Masking is something that when you repress that authenticness of yourself, when you're pretending to be something you're not, it's exhausting. We've talked about masking a lot, and the understanding that basically they call it the Coke bottle effect for a reason. When you go through a day and you're constantly repressing, you'll have experienced it at work where you've got to keep biting your tongue. There might be someone who's annoying you. It might be a situation that's just stressful, and you're coping with it, you're dealing with it, and you go home and maybe you just need an extra large glass of wine that evening, or maybe you just need to go out to the gym or put on some loud music or do whatever it is that you do. You've had those days. You're a bit snappier when you get home. Maybe you're a bit short-tempered with the kids and you think, I'm sorry I shouldn't have been like that, but I'm sorry, it's been a long day. It's a form of burnout. You're repressing your authentic self and you need to let it out at some point. If you can imagine doing that for years. So a kid who goes to school and is masking at school, they're repressing that all day and they get home to their safe place and it all explodes. It's the Coke bottle effect. It's like being shaken up all day. That bottle being shaken, repressed, more and more. Stuff a couple of Mentos in there as well. And as soon as they get home, the lid comes off and it explodes out. That's what so many people who mask experience. Masking is something girls do a lot more than boys. Both boys and girls would do it, but it's something that seems to be far more prevalent, I guess. Much more likely to be masking. And it's not a conscious decision most of the time. I think in later life it can become that. I'm going to mask now. There's a self-awareness that comes with it. But certainly for our kids, when they're in that situation, it's just a survival technique. I was speaking to someone the other day about fawning. So we talk about fight, flight, freeze a lot. There's a new addition to that, I think, which is fawning, which is basically people-pleasing. So for a lot of kids who are going to school, they will just lock into this fawn mode, people-pleasing, making everybody happy just because it's easier. You're masking what you really want. You're repressing it, and it's going to come out at home. So fawning and masking really do overlap very heavily. Masking is basically just learn techniques of getting through the day, repressing what's going on, learning certain responses to, how are you? I'm fine, thank you. Just because you know that's the words to say to get you through that bit, back in your seat and carry on. When you're masking at that level, it's very difficult. It leads to meltdowns and shutdowns and all kinds of, challenges when they get home to the safe environment. When you're doing that over multiple years, you think about, year reception year, kindergarten if you're in the States or wherever, kindergarten through to, year 12, that's a long time of your life to be repressing consistently. And it leads to these issues later on in life. The result is you get this burnout. It leads to severe depression. It can lead to, actual mental health conditions, which can be incredibly difficult to live with. So much can be done by unmasking, helping those we love who we know are neurodivergent to unmask and allow them to be their authentic selves. Get them in a place where they know they can trust you and they feel safe with you and they don't have to pretend to be something just to fit in. Great example of masking is peer pressure, something that so many people we all experience at one point or another. We put aside our personal beliefs. I think drugs and drinking have a lot, there's so many reasons people start drinking and taking drugs, but it's usually in a situation, you're at a party, you're with friends, and somebody offers you something, and you go, just do it this time. And it can lead to so many more problems down the track. You've repressed that part of you that knows that it's wrong, that doesn't want to go there. You've heard all the warnings all your life, you've been taught it at school. But in that moment, that peer pressure, someone buckles and caves and they do something which they may later on regret. That's what masking is. You're masking your true authentic self and what you really believe to fit in with the world around you. I think the biggest problem for people experiencing burnout, especially in the UK at the moment, is just the lack of resources and support that's out there. There are so many mental health charities that are overloaded because there's just not enough going on from the authorities to really support this. Where I live in Devon, it's even worse. I was speaking to a lady the other day who has a son he's just about to turn 18. He's 17. So CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service in the UK, kind of like, well, it's not our problem anymore. It's going to go to adult services. Adult services, well, he's not 18 yet. He doesn't have anybody who is his key worker or anything like that. He's at this in-between stage and there's nothing he can do. He needs meds. He's been on the meds. He knows they work. He's after them. He wants to be able to take these things to regulate himself because he recognises where he's at. The difference is he can't get them and nobody's supporting him through it. There are so many stories like that out there at the moment. People who have really severe mental health issues are at crisis point, especially when you consider just how stressful this world is at the moment between wars and cost of living crisis and lockdowns and pandemics and just politics in general and the way the world is. And it's just such a sad place and we get it all thrown at us constantly through the TV, through our social media. We're bombarded with this negativity. It can become such a hard place to be. People's mental health is really suffering, but getting the support for it, especially when you're at that crisis point, is so hard. We need to open up. So the best thing we can do is as friends. I do like that ITV have really sort of sprung on this with this Britain Get Talking. I like that they're putting that out there. It is something that's so important, but it's really about looking out for each other. If we know someone's struggling, being the person who says, I'm going to help you through this. I will put in the description details of mental health charities that are there to help, and also for neurodivergent support charities that may be there to help parents, carers, and neurodivergent people themselves to be able to get support through these things. It's so, so important. Look out for each other. The best thing we can do when someone's in this point of burnout is just be there. Be that listening ear, non-judgmental, not pushing them in any direction, being an ear, a shoulder to cry on, letting them know you're there, not forcing yourself in necessarily, not being, I'm turning up every day, hey, I'm here to get you out of the house, being able to just be there, hey, just stopping by to see how you're doing, I'll leave you to it, if you need me, you've got my number, call me, message me, whatever, are you okay if I check in again tomorrow and make sure you're okay? Getting permission, inviting them to invite you, I guess. It's that interaction that can be so important. It allows them to be in control of their own destiny in that way, I guess. Be there, support each other. Please also put in the comments if you've experienced anything like this, if you've got any techniques that you've had that really helps you to get through it. Not only that, if you've got things that that you've found helpful supporting other people or supporting yourselves, please put it in there. Check the links in the comments. It will be so helpful to so many. Please do go and do that. I will see you again on the next episode. In the meantime, please do stay safe.